What if a single decision made in a dusty Pennsylvania town could decide whether America survived or shattered? Join me as we relive the Battle of Gettysburg, the moment the Confederacy reached its high water mark and the Union fought for its very soul. Summer 1863. The United States has been at war with itself for more than 2 years, and the nation feels like a great vessel strained to the breaking point. Battles have scarred every season since Fort Sumter. Families from Maine to Texas live with the constant dread of a telegram that will shatter their household. The Union has tasted both victory and humiliation. But the deeper question whether a republic conceived in liberty can endure still hangs unresolved in the smoky air. In Richmond, President Jefferson Davis watches the war map with an almost grim serenity. The Confederacy, though blockaded and increasingly starved of resources, has not lost its will. Robert E. Lee, commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, embodies that will. Brilliant, audacious, and confident after triumphs at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, Lee believes the time has come to seize the initiative once more. His army is lean from long marches but hardened by success. If he can strike a decisive blow on northern soil, perhaps the Union's fragile political consensus will splinter. Lee's strategic vision is both practical and psychological. The fertile fields of Pennsylvania promise supplies his army desperately needs. A victory there could terrify northern cities, swing wavering politicians toward peace, and maybe just maybe win the recognition of foreign powers like Britain or France. He knows the gamble is enormous, but so is the potential reward. In Washington, President Abraham Lincoln reads each dispatch with quiet intensity. He has recently replaced General Joseph Hooker with the cautious but steady George Meade as commander of the Army of the Potomac. Lincoln understands that morale in the North wavers. The grisly casualty lists have drained the early war fervor. Yet he also senses a turning tide Union industry is awakening, and the Emancipation Proclamation has reframed the conflict as a moral crusade. A decisive Union victory on home soil could stiffen Northern resolve and convince the world that the United States will remain whole. As June unfolds, Lee moves. Roughly 70,000 veterans of the Army of Northern Virginia march northward through the lush Shenandoah Valley, their gray and butternut uniforms dulled by dust and summer sweat. They sing "Maryland, My Maryland," hoping the border states will rise to greet them as liberators. Behind them, long wagon trains carry sparse rations and the memories of recent victories. Ahead lies the rich farmland of Pennsylvania and the possibility of forcing a political settlement before the year is out. The Union Army shadows them like a wary predator. Major General Meade commands over 90,000 men, an immense force that stretches like a living river across Maryland roads. Scouts and cavalry screen its movements, but the exact whereabouts of Lee's columns remain elusive. Telegraph lines crackle with rumors. Some say the Confederates will menace Baltimore. Others whisper of a sudden thrust toward Harrisburg or even Philadelphia. The suspense grips northern newspapers and coffeehouse debates alike. Civilians along the Mason-Dixon line watch this deadly game of cat and mouse with mounting dread. Farm families hurry to hide livestock and grain. Church bells ring urgent meetings. In small towns, shopkeepers board their windows, and mothers hush children at the sound of distant hoofbeats. The war that had felt far away suddenly draws close, a dark cloud rumbling on the horizon. By late June, the two great armies are converging, though neither commander knows precisely where the clash will erupt. Chance, as much as grand design, will dictate the meeting ground. The small crossroads town of Gettysburg, its quiet streets lined with red brick houses and shaded by summer elms, sits almost unsuspectingly in their path. Farmers there tend wheat fields ripening to gold, unaware that their gentle hills will soon echo with cannon thunder and the cries of tens of thousands. It is difficult from our vantage in history to capture the sense of breathless uncertainty that gripped the country in those days. Telegraph offices worked through the night as operators tapped out fragmentary reports. In New York and Boston, merchants wondered whether Confederate raiders might burn their docks. In Washington, members of Congress peered across the Potomac and asked whether the Capitol itself might fall. The very idea of the Union, that a government of the people, by the people, for the people, could survive secession and civil war, seemed poised on a knife's edge. Meanwhile, Lee issues his orders with deliberate calm. His army fans out across the rolling Pennsylvania countryside, gathering supplies of food, livestock, and shoes for the men who have marched hundreds of miles in worn-out boots. He believes Meade is still south of the Potomac, and that he can choose the ground for a decisive engagement. Yet Union cavalry, under the vigilant eye of General John Buford, probes ever closer like hawks circling above the clouds. On June 30th, a warm, dusty day, an advance brigade of Confederate soldiers under General Henry Heth nears Gettysburg, hoping to secure a cache of shoes rumored to be stored there. They encounter unexpected resistance Union cavalry pickets holding firm on the outskirts of town. Heth reports back skeptical of the strength of these Federal riders. To him, they are probably just local militia easily scattered. But in the gathering twilight of that Pennsylvania evening, the stage is set for something far greater than a skirmish over supplies. Night falls. Campfires glow across ridges and meadows as men on both sides settle uneasily, unaware that dawn will bring the opening shots of the largest battle ever fought on American soil. In the quiet of those fields, crickets sing a deceptively peaceful chorus above a nation on the brink of its greatest trial. The first day of July 1863 broke with a humid haze over the rolling hills and tidy farms surrounding Gettysburg. The town still slumbered as a few shopkeepers swept their doorways and milkmaids led cows to pasture. Yet on the roads west of town, the rumble of boots and the metallic rattle of canteens told a different story. Two mighty armies were converging, though neither commander fully grasped how near the other had drawn. Shortly after sunrise, the Confederate brigades of General Henry Heth pushed east from Cashtown toward Gettysburg. Heth's mission was simple on paper scout. The town secure rumored supplies, especially shoes, and withdraw if necessary. He still believed he faced only scattered militia or small detachments of Union cavalry. But hidden behind fences and tree lines were the experienced horsemen of Brigadier General John Buford veterans, who had shadowed Lee's movements for days. Buford understood that the high ridges south of Gettysburg offered an ideal defensive line. If he could delay the Confederates long enough for the Union infantry to arrive, the Army of the Potomac might hold those ridges and force Lee into a battle of Meade's choosing. At approximately 7:30 a.m., the first gunshots cracked through the mist near Willoughby Run. Confederate skirmishers met Buford's dismounted cavalry in a sudden burst of smoke and lead. The Union troopers, fighting like seasoned infantry, used their breech-loading carbines to fire rapidly from behind fence rails and low stone walls. Every volley slowed the gray-clad lines inching toward the town. The Confederates advanced methodically, their ranks shimmering in the rising heat. But Buford's men refused to yield easily. From his perch atop a cupola in town, Buford watched enemy columns stretch across the fields and sent urgent messages to Major General John Reynolds, commander of the Union First Corps, pleading for reinforcements. Time measured in the sharp staccato of carbine fire was his currency, and he spent it with disciplined fury. Reynolds responded with remarkable speed. One of the Union Army's most respected leaders, he rode at the head of the famed Iron Brigade men in tall black hardy hats, who had already earned a fearsome reputation at battles like Antietam. By late morning, their blue columns poured into the fight west of town, banners snapping in the breeze. Civilians peered from windows as the thunder of marching boots and rolling artillery echoed down Gettysburg's quiet streets. Reynolds wasted no time deploying his troops into McPherson's Woods, a patch of oak forest that offered precious cover. Riding forward to direct his regiments, he exuded the calm confidence of a man who knew the value of seizing ground quickly. "Forward, men! Drive those fellows back!" he shouted moments before a Confederate sharpshooter's bullet struck him behind the ear. Reynolds fell from his horse lifeless before he touched the earth. His death shocked the Union ranks, but his decisive action had bought the Federals priceless minutes and anchored their line on the wooded ridge. Throughout the late morning, the battle swelled. Union brigades of the 1st Corps fought ferociously, their black hats stark against the sunlit fields as they exchanged volleys with Heth's advancing divisions. The air thickened with powder smoke, the acrid tang of gunpowder mixed with the sweet scent of trampled clover. Soldiers described the eerie, continuous roar of musketry as like the tearing of a giant sheet of canvas. By midday, the Confederates pressed hard from the west and north. General Abner Doubleday, now commanding the Union 1st Corps after Reynolds' death, rushed reserves to threatened points along the line. Despite being outnumbered, the Federals held stubbornly their disciplined volleys, repelling repeated assaults. Casualties mounted on both sides, men fell in clusters amid the wheat and knee-high grass, their uniforms streaked with sweat and powder burns. Yet the Confederates were not idle. Reinforcements under Major General Robert Rhodes of Ewell's Corps approached from the north, threatening to envelop the Union right flank. Clouds thickened overhead, muting the sunlight, as if the heavens themselves anticipated the gathering storm. From Seminary Ridge, Confederate artillery opened a punishing bombardment, sending shells shrieking over the fields and into the Union positions. Trees splintered and earth erupted under the pounding fire. Around 2 p.m., elements of the Union 11th Corps arrived to bolster the defense, taking positions north of the town. But their line stretched dangerously thin across open ground. Rhodes's fresh Confederate brigade slammed into them with relentless force, while Jubal Early's division swept in from the northeast. The Bluecoats fought desperately, but the pressure from 2 converging Confederate wings became unbearable. By mid-afternoon, the entire Union front shuddered. Doubleday's men, exhausted and outflanked, began to withdraw toward Gettysburg itself. What had begun as a cautious reconnaissance for shoes had erupted into a full-scale battle, and the Confederates were gaining the upper hand. As the Federals fell back, pockets of soldiers staged fighting retreats, firing from behind stone walls and garden fences, determined to slow the gray tide. Civilians crouched in cellars as bullets shattered windows and cannonballs tore through rooftops. The retreat soon became a frantic race through Gettysburg's narrow streets. Horses reared wagons, overturned, and terrified townspeople scrambled for safety. Yet even in chaos, discipline flickered. Rearguard Union regiments turned again and again to fire controlled volleys, buying precious seconds for their comrades to reach the hills south of town. The sound of musketry echoed off brick facades, mingled with the cries of the wounded and the ringing of church bells. By late afternoon, Confederate troops occupied much of Gettysburg. General Richard Ewell, commanding the left wing of Lee's army, surveyed the scene. His orders from Lee were to seize the heights south of town, Cemetery Hill, if practicable. Ewell weighed the bloodied state of his men and the uncertain strength of the Union forces now rallying on those ridges. The opportunity hung before him like ripe fruit, but he hesitated. Perhaps the Federals were stronger than they appeared. Perhaps darkness and fatigue counseled caution. He chose to wait for reinforcements. That pause would prove critical. Under cover of dusk, Union soldiers streamed onto Cemetery Hill and the higher ground along Cemetery Ridge and Culp's Hill. Engineers and infantry alike threw up barricades and dug shallow trenches. Lanterns flickered along the ridgeline as officers positioned artillery and reorganized battered brigades. They knew the fight was far from over, but they now held terrain that any general would envy, a natural fortress shaped like a fishhook, perfect for defense. As night fell on July 1st, the fields north and west of Gettysburg lay littered with the dead and dying. More than 15,000 men had been killed, wounded, or captured in a single day. The air reeked of powder smoke and the iron scent of blood. Crickets chirped again, their song eerie against the moans of the wounded. Farmers who had awakened to a peaceful dawn now found their barns crowded with makeshift hospitals and their fences splintered by shot and shell. Lee rode forward to confer with his lieutenants. The first clash had gone well for the Confederacy, yet the enemy now held formidable high ground. Should he attack again at once before the Union could reinforce, or wait for the rest of his army to assemble and plan a more decisive strike? His decision and the courage of the men who would carry it out would determine the shape of the battle to come. South of town, General George Meade arrived on the scene near midnight. He studied the fishhook line his troops were digging in along Cemetery Ridge and Hill. Tired but resolute, he recognized its strength immediately and ordered the army to stand and fight there. If Lee attacks, he told his staff, we will give him all the battle he wants. The stage was set. July 1st had begun with a search for shoes and ended with the Union Army entrenched on commanding heights and the Confederates pondering their next move. The quiet Pennsylvania town of Gettysburg had become the crucible where the fate of a divided nation would soon be decided. Dawn on July 1st had cracked over gentle farmland, but by late morning, the quiet ridges west of Gettysburg were transformed into a maelstrom of smoke-splintered trees and the terrible chorus of musketry. The clash that began as a reconnaissance for shoes now raged into full-scale battle. At its center stood Major General John Fulton Reynolds, a career soldier whose steady leadership and quiet bravery had already earned him the respect of the entire Army of the Potomac. Reynolds had hurried north after receiving John Buford's desperate messages. Riding at the head of the storied Iron Brigade, he pushed his men through choking summer dust, aware that every minute's delay might cost the Union the precious high ground south of town. His dark eyes scanned the horizon as he entered McPherson's Woods, a stand of oaks and hickories west of Gettysburg, where Buford's cavalry fought doggedly to hold back the gray tide. Forward, men forward for Pennsylvania witnesses later recalled him shouting as he waved his hat to urge the troops on. His words carried above the rattle of carbines and the booming Confederate artillery. It was a moment that fused courage with urgency. The fate of the entire Union position might depend on how long these woods could be held. Reynolds dismounted to direct a regiment of the Iron Brigade, his tall frame clearly visible amid the smoke. At 10:15 a.m., a sharpshooter's bullet found him striking just behind the ear. He toppled silently from his horse dead before he touched the ground. Soldiers who adored him were stunned. Some wept openly, even as they fired their rifles. Yet Reynolds' quick action before his death meant reinforcements were already deploying, and the Union line stiffened at precisely the critical moment. The Iron Brigade farm boys and lumbermen from Wisconsin, Michigan, and Indiana fought like men possessed. Clad in their distinctive black hardy hats, they poured disciplined volleys into advancing Confederates of Heth's division. The woods erupted with smoke so thick it turned midday to twilight. Leaves and splinters rained down as artillery shells ripped through branches overhead. Men described the continuous roar as like tearing cloth the size of the sky. To the north, Union brigades from the 1st Corps extended the line while Confederate numbers grew steadily. General Abner Doubleday, now commanding after Reynolds' death, rode along the front to rally the men. "Hold fast, boys. This is the ground we fight on," he urged. The Federals fired, reloaded, and fired again, their ramrods striking home in a relentless rhythm. Despite mounting casualties, they repulsed repeated Confederate charges, each wave leaving the field littered with gray-clad bodies. But the pressure intensified. Around midday, Robert Rodes's Confederate division swung in from the north, threatening the Union right. Their arrival was like a hammer striking an anvil already ringing with stress. The 11th Corps of the Union Army moved up in haste, forming a line across open ground to blunt the blow. Sunlight glinted on bayonets as blue ranks stretched dangerously thin, the men feeling the trap closing around them. Civilians watched in horror from attic windows and church steeples. The normally quiet Pennsylvania market town echoed with the unearthly clamor of war, crashing artillery shouted orders and the screams of the wounded. Farmers huddled in root cellars while stray bullets shattered glass and tore through clappered walls. One woman later recalled crouching beside her children as a cannonball thundered through her parlor, showering them with splinters. By early afternoon, the struggle reached a fever pitch. Confederates poured in from west and north, overlapping the Union flanks. Despite heroic resistance, the Union line began to buckle. Doubleday's 1st Corps had fought for hours without relief. Ammunition ran low and casualties mounted in grim heaps. Still, the soldiers fired from fence rails, garden walls, and shallow trenches, slowing the enemy with stubborn valor. The collapse came swiftly after 3 p.m. When Jubal Early's division surged from the northeast, the 11th Corps crumpled. Panic rippled down the line as soldiers realized they were nearly surrounded. Officers shouted for an orderly retreat, but the roar of musketry and the choking haze made calm impossible. Whole regiments fell back through the streets of Gettysburg, some fighting every step, others breaking into a desperate run. The retreat became a scene of chaos and courage intertwined. Wagons jammed narrow lanes, horses screamed, and townsfolk darted for cover as blue-clad soldiers spilled into alleys and back gardens. Yet rearguard units staged fighting withdrawals, wheeling again and again to unleash volleys at the pursuing Confederates. Their sacrifice bought vital minutes for comrades to reach the commanding ridges south of town Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge, where General Winfield Scott Hancock would soon rally them. Confederate troops swept through Gettysburg, their battle flags catching the late afternoon sun. Smoke curled from shattered windows, but just beyond the town's southern edge loomed the high ground Lee coveted, now bristling with Union artillery and fortifying infantry. Here, the story might have ended in Confederate triumph had Lee's orders been more forceful. He had instructed General Richard Ewell to seize those heights if practicable, a phrase that left too much to judgment. Ewell, mindful of his exhausted men and uncertain of the enemy's numbers, chose caution. He paused, waiting for reinforcements rather than pressing the attack. It was a decision heavy with consequence. Each passing minute allowed Union soldiers to strengthen their lines, dig rifle pits, and position guns. By nightfall, the once vulnerable hills had become a fortress. As darkness settled, lanterns flickered along the ridges where Union survivors regrouped. Men who had marched and fought for 15 relentless hours slumped behind stone walls, too tired even to speak. Surgeons worked by candlelight in farmhouses now converted to hospitals, their saws and scalpels gleaming crimson. Across the fields lay more than 15,000 casualties, dead and wounded from both armies, mute testimony to the ferocity of the first day. Lee rode into Gettysburg at dusk, the smell of powder and sweat thick in the cooling air. His army held the town, but he recognized the formidable challenge ahead. The Union occupied higher ground in a strong arc, a natural fishhook of hills and ridges. Breaking that line would require daring and blood. Yet Lee believed the moment demanded boldness. A decisive victory here might still win the war. South of town, Union's Commander George Meade arrived near midnight. He walked the crest of Cemetery Ridge under a moon veiled by smoke, measuring distances with a soldier's eye. The ground was perfect for defense, elevated, compact, and anchored by natural barriers. Turning to his staff, he said simply, "We will fight here." His calm words belied the storm to come. The first day at Gettysburg had ended with tragedy and tenacity. John Reynolds lay dead, but his swift action and sacrifice ensured the Union Army held the very ground that could decide the war. For the Confederacy, the opportunity to seize those heights had slipped away like daylight over the Blue Ridge. Both armies braced for the next act in a drama that would shape the nation's destiny. Night draped itself over Gettysburg on July 1st, 1863, but the day's fury still clung to the air. The acrid scent of burned powder and splintered wood mixed with the metallic tang of blood. Lanterns flickered in shattered windows as townspeople crept from hiding, stunned by the devastation. In the gathering dark, cries of the wounded carried across the fields long, low moans that made sleep impossible for soldiers and civilians alike. For the Union Army, the first day had been a brutal initiation. General John Reynolds was dead. The 1st Corps battered, the 11th Corps shaken. Yet the survivors were not beaten. They streamed through Gettysburg's narrow streets in a disciplined if hurried retreat toward the commanding high ground to the South Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, and Culp's Hill. These heights formed a natural defensive arc, a fishhook of stone and soil that promised salvation if they could hold it. The retreat itself was a scene of both chaos and resolve. Blue-clad soldiers stumbled through alleys and gardens, muskets clutched tight, their faces streaked with soot and sweat. Rearguard regiments paused at intersections to fire controlled volleys, slowing the Confederate advance. Officers barked orders above the din, urging men to keep moving toward the ridges. Wagons rattled over cobblestones carrying wounded comrades who groaned beneath hastily applied bandages. Gettysburg civilians, some still trembling from hours spent in cellars, emerged to offer water, tear strips of cloth for bandages, or guide soldiers through back lanes towards safety. Behind them, the gray tide pressed forward. Confederate troops surged into town from the west and north, their flags snapping in the warm night breeze. They moved cautiously, wary of ambushes in the narrow streets, but their momentum was undeniable. Windows shattered under stray musket balls. Church steeples bore scars from artillery rounds. The once quiet Pennsylvania town had become a battleground of echoing boots and clanging metal. General Richard Ewell, commanding the Confederate Second Corps, reached the outskirts of Gettysburg as dusk deepened. His men, bloodied and exhausted after the day's fierce fighting, looked toward Cemetery Hill, where Union lanterns now dotted the crest like watchful stars. Lee's order to Ewell had been clear yet maddeningly conditional: seize the heights if practicable. Ewell weighed the instruction. His troops were weary, their ranks thinned. Reports suggested the enemy was rallying in force. To attack in darkness across unknown terrain risked a slaughter. He chose to wait. That decision, so easy to rationalize in the moment, would echo through history. Each minute of delay allowed Union engineers and infantry to fortify the hills. Soldiers clawed at the rocky soil with bayonets and tin cups, throwing up earthworks and stacking stone walls. Artillery batteries unlimbered their guns, positioning them to sweep the approaches with deadly fire. The Fishhook Line was taking shape, a natural fortress that would challenge any attacker. South of town, General Winfield Scott Hancock arrived to assume temporary command until Meade reached the field. Hancock was a soldier of imposing presence and quick judgment. As he rode the length of the ridges, he immediately recognized their potential. "I think this is the strongest position by nature upon which to fight a battle that I ever saw," he told his aides. His confidence steadied the weary troops. Units that had been routed hours earlier now dug in with renewed determination, inspired by the conviction that they could hold. While the Union Consolidated Lee surveyed the town from Seminary Ridge, the Confederate commander was encouraged by the day's gains but troubled by the formidable heights ahead. His army had marched far and fought hard. Supplies of food and ammunition were dwindling. Still, Lee sensed opportunity. A decisive victory on northern soil could shatter Union morale and perhaps bring foreign recognition for the Confederacy. He hoped to strike again at first light before Meade could bring up his full force. Meanwhile, the citizens of Gettysburg endured a night of terror and confusion. Homes became impromptu hospitals, their parlors and kitchens crowded with bleeding soldiers. The Lutheran Theological Seminary, its cupola, used as a lookout during the day, was now a refuge for the wounded. Local women like Mary Wade and Elizabeth Thorne worked tirelessly, boiling water, binding wounds, and comforting the dying. Outside, the groans of men and the occasional crack of a distant rifle punctuated the humid night. By midnight, the main body of the Army of the Potomac was on the march toward Gettysburg. General George Meade, appointed to command only days earlier, rode north with determination. Scouts reported that the high ground south of town offered a perfect defensive line. Meade resolved to make his stand there, issuing orders to concentrate the entire army on that position. His calm confidence belied the urgency of the moment. He knew that if the Confederates seized those hills first, the war's balance could tilt dangerously. As the hours crept toward dawn, the Union line took shape like a great iron hook. Its curve began at Culp's Hill on the right, arced along Cemetery Hill and Ridge, and ended at the rocky knoll of Little Round Top on the left. Engineers positioned artillery on the heights, their dark silhouettes busy with shovels and spades. Soldiers from multiple corps, tired, hungry, but resolute, dug rifle pits and stacked fence rails, determined to make the position impregnable. On the Confederate side, campfires dotted the fields west of town. Men cooked meager rations of cornmeal and salt pork, their conversations low and speculative. Some believed they would attack at dawn and drive the Yankees into the Susquehanna River. Others, recalling the heavy losses of the day, doubted the wisdom of another frontal assault. Among the officers, debate simmered. Lieutenant General James Longstreet, Lee's trusted corps commander, urged a sweeping maneuver to the south to threaten the Union's flank and force Meade to attack. Lee listened, but remained intent on striking the entrenched Federals where they stood. As the night deepened, a humid stillness settled over the ridges. Fireflies flickered among the grasses where thousands of men had fallen only hours earlier. The dead lay unburied, their lifeless forms illuminated by a ghostly moon. The wounded cried out for water, for mothers, for mercy. Surgeons worked by candlelight in barns and parlors, the rasp of saws and the muffled groans of amputations carrying into the darkness. When dawn finally broke on July 2nd, the Union Army occupied a position that many generals would have envied: a compact interior line anchored by steep hills and rock-strewn slopes. Nearly 70,000 Union soldiers now held this ground, their bayonets glinting in the early light. Across the fields, Lee's 57,000 Confederates prepared for the next move, their gray ranks poised like coiled steel. The first day of Gettysburg had ended in Confederate advantage, but strategic uncertainty. Lee's army possessed the town, but the Union held the heights, and with them the initiative. The stage was set for the next and bloodiest act of the great battle, when Lee would gamble on audacity, and the Union would test the strength of its hastily built fortress. The sun climbed over the Pennsylvania hills on July 2nd in 1863, casting a golden haze across fields still scarred by the previous day's carnage. From the crest of Cemetery Hill, Union soldiers looked out on a landscape littered with the debris of war-broken muskets, torn haversacks, and the silent forms of men who had fallen where they fought. Below them, the town of Gettysburg lay eerily quiet, its brick homes pockmarked by bullets, and its streets stained dark where blood had dried overnight. General George Meade arrived on the field just before dawn and quickly grasped the advantages of the Union position. The army now occupied a natural defensive arc shaped like a giant fishhook. The eye of that hook rested on Culp's Hill to the east, curved westward, along Cemetery Hill, then south along Cemetery Ridge, before ending at the rocky heights of Little Round Top. This interior line allowed for rapid reinforcement from one sector to another, a crucial asset against any Confederate thrust. Meade walked the ridgeline with his staff, taking in each rise and slope. He ordered breastworks strengthened and artillery batteries placed where they could sweep the open approaches with canister and shell. Infantrymen dug rifle pits with bayonets and tin cups, piling stones into low walls that would soon be tested by fire. "If Lee attacks, we shall give him all the battle he wants," Meade told a subordinate, his voice calm but resolute. Across the shallow valley to the west, Robert E. Lee surveyed the Union fortifications from Seminary Ridge. His army had performed brilliantly the day before, driving the Federals through town and inflicting heavy losses. Yet he understood that the enemy now held commanding ground. Lee's lieutenants debated strategy. James Longstreet, his trusted corps commander, argued for a wide maneuver south and east to place the Confederate army between Meade and Washington and force the Federals to attack. Lee listened but remained convinced that a direct blow could break the Union line. "They are there, and I am going to strike them," he said. Through the morning hours, both armies braced. Union engineers improved barricades while soldiers snatched brief moments of rest, drinking from canteens filled with tepid water and eating hardtack softened in coffee. In Gettysburg, civilians moved cautiously through shattered streets, tending to the wounded in homes and churches. The moans of injured men mixed with the low rumble of distant artillery as Confederate batteries adjusted their positions. By mid-morning, the Union Army was nearly complete. 6 of Meade's 7 corps, about 69,000 men, occupied the heights. The last corps was still on the march, but expected before nightfall. Flags snapped in the summer breeze along the ridgeline, and the sight of reinforcements heartened troops who had endured the brutal first day. Confidence began to replace the fatigue of retreat. Lee studied the Union line carefully. Its northern curve on Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill was strong and well defended. He judged that an assault there would be costly and uncertain. Instead, he fixed his gaze on the southern end of the Union line, where the ridges sloped toward low farmland and orchards. A heavy strike there, he believed, might roll up the Union flank and open the road to Baltimore or even Washington. To support this plan, he directed General Richard Ewell to mount a diversionary attack on the Union right, pinning those forces in place, while the main assault under Longstreet would smash into the Union left. As Confederate troops shifted to their positions, a quiet tension settled over the field. The morning sun grew hot, and the scent of trampled grass mingled with the faint odor of powder still lingering from the day before. Birds wheeled overhead, their calls oddly cheerful against the ominous silence of waiting armies. Among the Union ranks, soldiers prepared as best they could for the storm they knew was coming. Some wrote hurried letters home, scrawling words of love and resolve on scraps of paper. Others cleaned their rifles and checked ammunition, their faces set in grim determination. Chaplains moved from regiment to regiment, offering prayers and words of comfort. The men understood that this day might decide the fate of the Union. Shortly after noon, the first artillery shots cracked the stillness. From the northern sector, Ewell's guns began a probing bombardment of the Union right at Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill. Shells screamed overhead, exploding in bursts of dirt and splintered wood. Union artillery responded, and for a time the ridges echoed with the thunder of dueling cannon. Yet this was but a feint meant to distract Meade from the true danger forming to the south. There, on the Confederate right, Longstreet's divisions assembled for a massive strike. His troops, veterans from Texas, Alabama, and Georgia, moved into position along Seminary Ridge, their bayonets glinting in the afternoon sun. Hidden behind wooded slopes and rolling farmland, they prepared to march east toward the peach orchard, the wheat field, and the rocky heights of Devil's Den and Little Round Top. Back on the Union side, General Daniel Sickles commanded the 3rd Corps, tasked with holding the southern stretch of Cemetery Ridge. Meade had ordered him to anchor his line along the gentle rise near the ridge's base. But Sickles, restless and headstrong, studied the ground ahead of him and grew uneasy. About half a mile forward lay a slightly higher patch of terrain surrounding a peach orchard. Convinced that holding this small rise would better protect his position, Sickles made a fateful choice. Without awaiting Meade's approval, he advanced his corps to occupy the orchard and the low ground of the Emmitsburg Road. This movement created a dangerous salient, a bulging line exposed on 3 sides to enemy attack. Union officers watched in alarm as Sickles' men spread out across the fields, their new line too long and too thin to defend effectively. The gap between his corps and the rest of the army widened like a wound, one the Confederates would soon exploit. By late afternoon, Longstreet was ready. His artillery began a heavy bombardment aimed at Sickles' advanced positions. The thunder of cannon rolled across the valley, shaking windows in Gettysburg and sending flocks of birds skyward in panic. Union gunners replied in kind, their own guns belching flame and smoke from the ridges. The sky darkened with drifting powder clouds as the great clash of July 6 commenced. For soldiers on both sides, the moments before the infantry assaults were almost unbearable. The earth trembled with each cannon blast. Men tightened their grips on rifle stocks and exchanged silent glances with comrades. Some whispered prayers, others simply stared ahead, faces pale, beneath the grime of 2 days' battle. The fields south of Gettysburg, quiet farmland only the week before, were about to become one of the most savage killing grounds of the Civil War. The decisions made in these tense hours, Meade's resolve, Sickles' disobedience, Lee's audacity would shape the furious engagements at Devil's Den, the wheat field, the peach orchard, and the rocky summit of Little Round Top. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, the fate of armies and the destiny of a nation teetered on the brink. The early afternoon heat of July 2nd, 1863, shimmered over the undulating farmland south of Gettysburg. Birds wheeled above ripening wheat, and the heavy scent of summer clover hung in the air. Along the Union left flank, however, the mood was far from tranquil. Major General Daniel Sickles, commander of the Union 3rd Corps, studied the landscape through his field glasses and felt a rising unease. Meade's official orders placed Sickles' corps along the lower slopes of Cemetery Ridge, a strong but slightly depressed position. From there, his men could support the rest of the Union line and remain shielded by the ridge's natural contours. Yet to Sickles' eye, a small rise half a mile ahead, the peach orchard seemed a stronger post. From that modest height, Confederate artillery might threaten the ridge itself if left unoccupied. Convinced he saw a tactical flaw, Sickles wrestled with his decision. He was a political general more used to the halls of Congress than the smoke of battle, but he possessed a gambler's instinct and an ego to match. At about 2 p.m., without waiting for approval from Meade, Sickles ordered his corps forward. Brigades tramped across the Emmitsburg Road and fanned out into the peach orchard and wheat field, extending toward the rocky knolls of Devil's Den. Dust rose in hazy columns as the men dragged artillery into place and began hastily erecting fence rail breastworks. Officers nearby exchanged worried glances. By pushing outward, Sickles had created a bulging salient, an exposed curve of troops vulnerable to attack from 3 directions and dangerously detached from the main Union line. General Meade arrived soon after and was alarmed. He confronted Sickles, demanding to know why his corps was so far advanced. Sickles defended his move, insisting the orchard was vital ground. Meade, furious but pragmatic, realized it was too late to withdraw without inviting immediate assault. He ordered reinforcements to support Sickles and braced for the inevitable Confederate strike. Across the valley, Lieutenant General James Longstreet was already preparing that blow. Longstreet's 1st Corps veterans from Texas, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina had marched under a broiling sun to reach the staging area along Seminary Ridge. Lee's plan called for a massive attack sweeping northeast, rolling up the Union left and cutting into the rear of Meade's army. Longstreet, methodical and cautious, disagreed with the frontal assault but followed Lee's instructions with grim resolve. By mid-afternoon, Confederate artillery opened with a sudden thunderous roar. Shells shrieked across the fields, exploding among Sickles' men in the peach orchard and along the Emmitsburg Road. Splinters of rail fence and shards of stone scythed through the air. The Union guns answered in a deafening duel that sent black powder clouds drifting like storm banks across the countryside. Farmers miles away paused at the strange rumble, mistaking it for distant thunder. Then around 4 p.m., the gray lines advanced. From woods west of the Emmitsburg Road emerged Brigadier General John Bell Hood's division, Texans and Alabamians moving with relentless purpose. Their target, the rocky outcrop known as Devil's Den, and the gentle slopes of Little Round Top beyond. Rebel yells pierced the artillery din as they surged across the fields, their bayonets catching flashes of sunlight. Union defenders at Devil's Den, a jumble of boulders and scrub, braced for impact. 2 Confederate brigades charged headlong into the rocky maze. Muskets cracked at near point-blank range, the echo magnified by the stone. Control of the position shifted back and forth in a brutal dance of charge and countercharge. Soldiers fought with rifle butts and bayonets among the boulders, the acrid smoke clinging to the rocks like a living fog. Farther south, Hood's Alabamians angled toward Little Round Top, a steep hill that anchored the Union extreme left. At first, it was nearly undefended. Only a handful of signalmen occupied the summit. Recognizing the danger, Union Colonel Strong Vincent rushed his brigade from the 5th Corps to the crest just as the Confederates approached. Under a rain of artillery fire, Vincent deployed his regiments in a thin line around the hilltop, each man ordered to hold at all costs. The fighting there was savage and relentless. Waves of gray swept up the slopes, clambering over rocks slick with sweat and powder residue. Vincent's men fired until barrels grew too hot to touch. When the Confederates regrouped and attacked again, the defenders stretched their line perilously thin to prevent a flanking maneuver. Bullets hummed like angry bees. The air was thick with smoke and shouted orders. Colonel Vincent himself fell mortally wounded, refusing evacuation until his line was secure. At the far left flank of that line stood the 20th Maine Regiment, under Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, a former college professor turned warrior. His men had already repelled repeated assaults and were nearly out of ammunition. As another charge gathered below Chamberlain, faced a dire choice: retreat and expose the entire Union flank, or take the fight to the enemy. Fix bayonets, he ordered. With a cry that echoed across the rocks, the 20th Maine swept down the slope in a wild wheeling charge. The unexpected counterattack stunned the Confederate attackers, who broke and fled down the hillside. The extreme left of the Union Army was saved. Meanwhile, the battle for the Peach Orchard intensified. General Lafayette McLaws' division crashed into Sickles' advanced position from the west, while Brigadier General William Barksdale's Mississippians struck with ferocious speed. Grape shot and musket fire turned the orchard into a storm of splinters and smoke. Union regiments fought stubbornly among the peach trees, their branches shredded and fruit scattered across the trampled earth. But the salient could not be held. As Confederate brigades attacked from multiple sides, Sickles's line began to crumple. In the wheat field just east of the Orchard, Union and Confederate forces collided in chaotic seesaw combat. Regiments charged and countercharged through waist-high grain until the golden stalks were flattened and stained dark red. The field changed hands repeatedly, the ground so thick with smoke that men sometimes fired at the flash of an enemy's musket rather than the man himself. Survivors later spoke of the strange beauty of the scene: sunlight slanting through drifting clouds of powder, the wheat bending under the weight of the fallen. As the fighting raged, Sickles rode along the line to rally his troops when a Confederate cannonball struck his right leg. The impact mangled bone and muscle, throwing him from his horse. Calm amid the chaos, he propped himself on an elbow and lit a cigar while stretcher bearers carried him from the field, his legs soon to be amputated. His personal gamble had cost the 3rd Corps dearly. Yet the Union Army did not break. Reinforcements from the 2nd Corps under General Winfield Scott Hancock and from the 5th Corps poured in to stem the tide. Artillery batteries along Cemetery Ridge hurled canister into advancing Confederates, shredding their formations. As dusk settled, the Union left, though battered and bloody, remained unbroken. By nightfall, the fields south of Gettysburg were a vision of ruin. The peach orchard lay devastated, its trees shattered, and its soil soaked with blood. Devil's Den was strewn with bodies among the boulders. Little Round Top, saved by Vincent's quick action and Chamberlain's daring charge, stood firm, its rocky slopes echoing with the moans of wounded men. Smoke drifted over the wheat field where thousands of fallen soldiers carpeted the once golden grain. The cost was staggering. The Union suffered roughly 10,000 casualties on this sector alone, including the near destruction of Sickles's 3rd Corps. Confederate losses, though slightly lower, were equally grievous. But Lee's plan to smash the Union left had failed. The fishhook line held. As darkness descended, both armies licked their wounds. Lanterns flickered among the rocks of Little Round Top and along the battered ridge, illuminating surgeons as they worked through the night. Cries of pain mingled with the rasp of saws and the low murmur of exhausted men. Officers on both sides contemplated the morrow, knowing the battle's outcome, and perhaps the fate of the entire war still hung in the balance. Night had fallen across Gettysburg's southern slopes, but the day's fury still burned in memory. July 2nd, 1863 would be remembered as a day of relentless combat, and nowhere did the struggle sear itself deeper into the earth than at the jumbled rocks of Devil's Den. Even now, lanterns bobbed among the boulders as stretcher bearers searched for the living and the dead, their lights casting long, ghostly shadows on stone that only hours earlier had echoed with the roar of musketry. Earlier that afternoon, the hill's twisted labyrinth of granite had seemed almost an afterthought in the Union line, low ground, rough and uneven, with scrub brush sprouting between massive stones. Yet its position made it vital whoever held Devil's Den could direct fire toward Little Round Top and the left flank of the Union Army. Confederate commanders recognized the opportunity. Around 4 p.m., Brigadier General Evander Law's Alabama Brigade and Brigadier General Jerome Robertson's Texans advanced under the overall command of John Bell Hood, who urged them forward despite a wound to his arm that would later require amputation. The approach to Devil's Den was a deadly gauntlet. Union sharpshooters hidden behind boulders and trees poured a steady fire into the advancing Confederates. The Texans and Alabamians pressed on, climbing over fences and wading through marshy ground, their gray uniforms dark with sweat and dust. Rebel yells pierced the air as they neared the rocks, and the defenders' soldiers from New York and Pennsylvania tightened their grips on rifle stocks, waiting for the clash. What followed was a brutal close-quarters struggle that defied the neat lines of traditional battle. The hill's massive stones formed natural breastworks and sudden blind corners. Musket smoke filled every crevice, turning the late afternoon light into a haze of blue-gray. Soldiers fired at shadows or at the flash of an enemy muzzle. Bayonets and rifle butts became weapons when space was too tight to reload. It was like fighting devils in a stone maze, one Union veteran later recalled. Time seemed to dissolve into a continuous roar of gunfire and shouts. Confederates surged among the rocks, driving Union troops back step by step. For a moment, the defenders rallied, hurling volleys from behind a jagged ridge and forcing the attackers to ground. But Hood's men regrouped and charged again, their battle flags snapping defiantly in the swirling smoke. At last, sheer weight of numbers tipped the balance. The Union line at Devil's Den broke, and the remaining defenders retreated toward Little Round Top. Yet victory came at a ghastly cost. Bodies lay scattered among the rocks, blue and gray, intermingled many in the very positions where they had fallen. The cries of the wounded echoed off the granite walls as dusk settled, a chorus of agony that haunted the living. Union sharpshooters withdrawing to higher ground continued to harry the Confederates, turning Devil's Den into a deadly trap, even in apparent conquest. Sharpshooters from the 124th New York fired with deadly accuracy from concealed positions, and for days afterward, Devil's Den remained a perilous place where a soldier might be struck down without warning. Meanwhile, to the north and east, the battle spread like wildfire. The wheat field became another cauldron of carnage. Waves of Union and Confederate troops charged and countercharged through waist-high grain, the stalks soon flattened and soaked in blood. Artillery shells burst overhead, raining iron fragments on friend and foe alike. It was a whirlpool of death, a survivor wrote. The ground changed hands repeatedly, sometimes within minutes, as brigades hurled themselves into the melee. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across a field where few would leave unscathed. Back at the Peach Orchard, General William Barksdale's Mississippians stormed Sickles's salient with ferocious determination. The orchard, once fragrant with ripening fruit, became a splintered ruin as musket fire shredded branches and cannonballs ripped through tree trunks. Union gunners fought to the last, wheeling their pieces to fire canister at point-blank range before being overwhelmed. The salient collapsed, forcing Federal troops into a desperate fallback towards Cemetery Ridge. Through it all, Sickles's 3rd Corps endured catastrophic losses. Whole regiments were reduced to a handful of men. Wounded soldiers lay in heaps along the Emmitsburg Road, many crying for water that would never come. Amid the chaos, reinforcements from the Union 2nd Corps and 5th Corps rushed forward, filling gaps and stabilizing the crumbling line. General Winfield Scott Hancock rode among them, his calm presence a steadying force as shells burst nearby. On the far left, the fight for Little Round Top raged with unrelenting intensity. After Chamberlain's daring bayonet charge drove the Alabamians down the slope, Confederate forces regrouped for yet another assault. The rocky hill echoed with the crack of rifles and the clash of steel as Union soldiers clung to their precarious positions. Strong Vincent, the brigade commander whose quick action had secured the hill, lay mortally wounded but refused to be carried off until he was certain the line would hold. Reinforcements finally arrived, sealing the flank and ending Confederate hopes of turning it. As darkness deepened, the landscape south of Gettysburg was a vision of devastation. Fires from shattered caissons flickered among the rocks of Devil's Den. The Peach Orchard was a charred skeleton of broken trees and fallen men. The wheat field lay matted and crimson, the once golden grain trampled into mud. Surgeons set up makeshift hospitals and barns and farmhouses, their saws and scalpels working under dim lantern light as the wounded groaned through the night. Yet despite the horrific cost, the Union Army's fishhook line remained intact. Lee's grand plan to roll up Meade's left flank had failed. Though the Confederates had seized Devil's Den and inflicted severe casualties, especially on Sickles's shattered corpse, they had not broken the Union position. Meade still held the commanding heights of Cemetery Ridge and Little Round Top, the very ground that would prove decisive. For the soldiers who survived the night offered little rest. Sharpshooters continued to fire sporadically, and the cries of the wounded carried across the fields. Men from both armies searched for water in the darkness, sometimes helping enemy wounded as well as their own. The smell of blood and powder lingered heavy in the humid air. As midnight approached, generals on both sides took stock. Lee, though heartened by the ground gained, recognized that his objectives had not been met. The Union line, though battered, was stronger than ever, bolstered by reinforcements and anchored by high ground. Longstreet, weary and skeptical of further frontal attacks, counseled caution, but Lee's resolve remained firm. He believed one more massive assault, this time at the Union center, might yet crack Meade's army and decide the war. Meade, for his part, prepared for whatever the morning might bring. He rode along the lines by lantern light, speaking quietly with regimental commanders and ensuring that artillery and infantry were positioned to meet another onslaught. His men, though exhausted, felt a growing confidence. They had survived the fiercest blows Lee could deliver and still held the high ground. When the sun rose again, it would reveal a battlefield transformed. The once quiet farms and orchards around Gettysburg had become a landscape of horror and heroism, a place where granite rocks and golden fields were forever stained by sacrifice. The struggle for Devil's Den, the Peach Orchard, and Little Round Top had ended, but the greatest test of courage for both armies still lay ahead. As the sun edged lower on July 2nd, the roar of cannon and musket along Gettysburg's southern flank swelled to a deafening crescendo. Amid the smoke and confusion, a seemingly modest hill, Little Round Top, emerged as the fulcrum on which the fate of the Union Army might pivot. If the Confederates seized this rocky height, they could rake the entire Union line along Cemetery Ridge and force Meade's army to abandon its formidable fishhook defenses. Everything depended on holding that hill. Earlier in the afternoon, Union signal officers atop Little Round Top had watched in alarm as Confederate brigades maneuvered below. They signaled frantically for reinforcements, but for a time only a handful of soldiers and a few artillery pieces guarded the summit. To the west, Devil's Den had already fallen after savage fighting, and Hood's Texans and Alabamians were sweeping around the Union left, seeking a way to turn it. The hill's capture seemed inevitable. Then came Colonel Strong Vincent of the Union 8th Corps, a young lawyer from Erie, Pennsylvania, whose quick judgment and iron resolve would shape history. Leading a brigade of 4 regiments, Vincent grasped the danger instantly. Without waiting for orders, he rushed his men up the rocky slopes, shouting for speed. The climb was brutal. Heat pressed down loose stones, slid underfoot, and enemy artillery already searched the heights with shell fire, but the brigade gained the crest just moments before the first Confederate skirmishers appeared. Vincent arrayed his regiments in a thin, bowed line along the southern face of the hill. On the extreme left, he placed the 20th Maine, commanded by the scholarly yet fiercely determined Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. To the right stood the 83rd Pennsylvania, 44th New York, and 16th Michigan. He told them plainly, this ground must be held at all hazards. The men understood that retreat was unthinkable. The Union flank rested entirely on their shoulders. Within minutes, gray-clad Alabamians of Law's brigade surged up the slope, their rebel yells echoing through the boulders. Muskets cracked and smoke rolled in choking clouds as Union soldiers fired from behind rocks and fallen logs. The Confederates came on again and again, their bayonets flashing in the slanting sun. Each time they were hurled back by disciplined volleys, but the pressure mounted. Casualties thinned the Union ranks, ammunition ran dangerously low. Strong. Vincent moved along the line, calmly directing fire despite the storm of bullets. A Minié ball struck him in the thigh, severing an artery. Mortally wounded, he refused to be carried off until he was certain the hill was secure. His men fought on, inspired by his sacrifice, but the attacks showed no sign of easing. On the far left, Chamberlain's 20th Maine bore the brunt of repeated charges. The professor-turned-colonel paced behind his men, urging them to hold. When word came that cartridges were nearly exhausted, he faced a grim calculation: one more assault might break them. Instead of waiting to be overrun, he chose audacity. Chamberlain ordered a bayonet charge, a downhill right-wheel maneuver designed to sweep the enemy flank. Bugles sounded. With a shout that mingled defiance and desperation, the Mainers surged forward, bayonets gleaming in the dying light. Their sudden onslaught startled the Alabamians, who faltered then broke. Many threw down arms, others fled back through the trees and rocks, chased by the wild cries of their adversaries. The Union left was saved in a dramatic instant of cold steel and sheer will. While Little Round Top held firm, the fight raged elsewhere. In the wheat field and peach orchard, combat had devolved into a nightmare of smoke and confusion. Regiments advanced and retreated so many times that survivors later likened the scene to a violent tide. The wheat flattened and crimsoned beneath trampling feet. Artillery thundered at point-blank range, and the dead lay in heaps where they had fallen. The setting sun cast long, blood-red streaks across the grain as the two armies ground each other down. Back at the peach orchard, Sickles' salient finally collapsed under relentless Confederate assault. Union guns roared until their barrels glowed, then were abandoned as infantry fell back towards Cemetery Ridge. Sickles himself, struck by a cannonball that shattered his right leg, smoked a cigar while being carried from the field, stoically remarking on the accuracy of the Confederate fire. His corps was mauled beyond recognition, but their stubborn defense had bought critical time for reinforcements to plug the gaps. As darkness settled, the Union line, though battered and bleeding, remained unbroken. Fires flickered among the rocks of Little Round Top, where soldiers tended the wounded. Surgeons set up field hospitals in barns and farmhouses, their saws rasping through bone as lanterns cast eerie shadows on blood-stained walls. Men who had fought for hours collapsed where they stood, too exhausted even to eat. Confederate troops, equally spent, withdrew to their lines along Seminary Ridge. Lee had hoped to crush the Union left and roll up Meade's army. Instead, he faced a stalemate bought with staggering casualties. Longstreet, who had argued against a direct assault, lamented the price paid for ground that yielded no decisive gain. Throughout the night, sharpshooters traded intermittent shots across the darkened fields. Cries of the wounded drifted through the humid air, a haunting counterpoint to the steady chirp of crickets. Soldiers from both armies crept cautiously to collect canteens of water, sometimes encountering enemy pickets who, in brief moments of human compassion, allowed each other safe passage to help the injured. When the pale light of dawn touched the Pennsylvania hills on July 3rd, both armies braced for another day of reckoning. The Union fishhook line was battered but intact, strengthened by fresh entrenchments, and reinforced by the courage proven at Little Round Top. Lee, undeterred by the bloody stalemate, prepared a bold new plan, a massive artillery bombardment, followed by an all-out assault on the Union center. The fiercest and most fateful day of the Battle of Gettysburg was about to begin. The third evening of the Gettysburg campaign descended into a crimson haze over the farmlands south of town. While the heroics at Little Round Top captured lasting fame, the carnage in the wheat field and peach orchard that same July 2nd evening equaled, some say, surpassed the savagery anywhere else on the battlefield. Here in gentle farm plots meant for harvest and quiet labor waves of men in blue and gray collided until the soil itself seemed to bleed. The wheat field, a whirl of charges. The wheat field stretched across roughly 20 acres of waist-high grain, golden and fragrant only days before. Now late afternoon sun slanted across stalks already flattened by artillery shells. Confederate brigades under General Joseph Kershaw and General William Barksdale pressed in from the west and south, their goal to exploit the bulge created by Sickles' overextended 3rd Corps and pierce the Union center left. Union forces from the 2nd Corps under General Winfield Scott Hancock and the 5th Corps under General George Sykes rushed in to meet them. Brigades led by Generals Zook, Cross, and Kelly counterattacked, their bayonets flashing in the lowering light. The field erupted in a chaos of smoke-splintered grain and deafening gunfire. It was like fighting inside a thundercloud, a Massachusetts soldier later wrote. The ground changed hands again and again. A Union brigade would surge forward, driving the Confederates back toward the woods, only to be flanked and forced out in turn. Men fired until their rifle barrels burned their palms. Others swung clubbed muskets when cartridges were gone. Cannon fire from both sides burst overhead, sending shards of iron and wheat stalks raining down together. The air smelled of powder earth and the iron tang of blood. As dusk approached, reinforcements from Caldwell's division poured in. Irish veterans who charged with bayonets leveled their green regimental flags, snapping. They pushed the Confederates to the western edge of the field, but exhaustion and ammunition shortages soon stalled the advance. A counterattack by General Wofford's brigade of Georgians slammed into their flank, and once more the Union line bent and retreated. By nightfall, the wheat field was a no-man's land, neither army willing to hold it after the slaughter. When the gunfire ceased, thousands of bodies carpeted the trampled grain. Survivors recalled stepping on fallen comrades, unable to avoid them in the darkness. The wheat, once golden, was matted and stained a deep, unnatural red. It was as if the earth itself had become flesh, one witness murmured. The Peach Orchard salient shattered. Just northwest of the wheat field stood the Peach Orchard, a modest grove that had become the focal point of Sickles' ill-fated salient. Earlier that afternoon, Barksdale's Mississippians had stormed the orchard with near-manic ferocity. Union artillery blasted canister into the charging gray ranks, tearing gaps only to see them filled again. Barksdale himself, sword raised and long hair flying, led his men through a storm of grape shot. He was mortally wounded, but lived long enough to know the orchard had fallen. Union defenders fought desperately among the peach trees. Cannon barrels glowed red as crews fired, until the last possible moment before retreating. Tree limbs shattered, showering fruit and splinters onto the men below. The sweet scent of crushed peaches mingled grotesquely with the smell of smoke and blood. By the time the Federals fell back towards Cemetery Ridge, the orchard was a wreck of splintered trunks and torn earth. The Union center tested. Even as these southern fields blazed with combat, Lee sought to widen the breach. At about 6 p.m., he ordered General Richard Anderson's division to strike the Union center along Cemetery Ridge. The line there had been thinned dangerously as Meade shifted troops south to shore up Sickles' salient. For a tense hour, the outcome hung in the balance. Confederate brigades under Wilcox and Wright surged up the gentle slope, overrunning advanced Union positions and even capturing a few cannon. But General Hancock, ever alert, galloped along the ridge, rallying reinforcements. Union artillery roared to life, and fresh infantry regiments poured in. After brutal hand-to-hand fighting near the copse of trees, the Confederates were forced back, leaving the center battered but intact. Night falls on a shattered landscape. As darkness crept across the fields, the day's fighting gradually sputtered to silence. The cries of the wounded filled the night, thousands pleading for water or a final mercy. Surgeons worked by lantern light in barns and farmhouses, hastily converted into hospitals. Amputation tables ran slick with blood. Piles of limbs grew high outside the doors. The moan of saws and the low prayers of chaplains became the grim soundtrack of the evening. Union casualties for July 2nd alone exceeded 10,000, with Sickles' 3rd Corps nearly destroyed. Confederate losses were slightly lower, but still staggering, a cost Lee could ill afford. And despite the carnage, the Union line, the crucial fishhook running from Culp's Hill to Little Round Top, held firm. Meade had survived the most massive assault Lee had yet delivered. Strategic crossroads. In his headquarters on Seminary Ridge, Robert E. Lee weighed the day's outcome. He had intended to envelop the Union left and break Meade's army apart. Instead, his troops held scattered patches of bloody ground, but no decisive advantage. Longstreet, his trusted corps commander, again advised maneuvering around the Union position to force Meade into the open. Lee listened, but remained convinced that the Federal center could be pierced by one powerful strike. Across the valley, Meade convened a late-night council of war in a small farmhouse on the Taneytown Road. Candlelight flickered on weary faces as corps commanders gave their assessments. Some urged retreat to more secure ground nearer the Union supply lines, but most, heartened by their troops' resilience and the strength of their position, recommended holding fast. Meade agreed. "We shall remain here," he declared. His quiet words carried immense weight. The Army of the Potomac would stand and fight. Outside, the night was heavy with humidity and the stench of battle. Fireflies flickered over fields littered with the dead. Occasional rifle shots rang out from skirmishers or nervous pickets, but for the most part, a tense stillness settled. Soldiers on both sides tried to snatch a few hours of rest on blood-soaked ground, knowing that dawn would bring yet another trial. July 2nd had ended with neither side claiming clear victory, but the strategic balance tilted toward the Union. Lee had expended precious men and material without breaking Meade's lines. The Confederate Army still occupied Gettysburg, but the Federals held the heights Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, and the hard-won summit of Little Round Top. Lee, undaunted, began planning a bold frontal assault for the next day, an attack that would become legend. The farms of Gettysburg, once peaceful places of labor and family, now lay transformed into a vast open-air graveyard. The wheat field and peach orchard in particular would forever bear the memory of desperate courage and unimaginable loss. A reminder that in war, even the most ordinary landscapes can become altars of sacrifice. Night settled slowly over Gettysburg on July 2nd, but the battle refused to release its grip. To the weary Union soldiers clinging to the heights of Cemetery Ridge and Cemetery Hill, the dimming light was no guarantee of peace. Smoke from the wheat field and peach orchard still drifted on the evening breeze, carrying with it the sharp scent of powder and the coppery tang of blood. Lanterns winked along the Union lines as officers checked ammunition and positioned artillery for yet another expected assault. Anderson's evening push. As the chaos raged on the southern flank that afternoon, General Robert E. Lee had not abandoned hope of piercing the Union center. At about 6 p.m., he ordered General Richard H. Anderson's division to strike the thinly held ridge directly in front of them. Earlier, Meade had siphoned troops southward to prop up Sickles's crumbling salient, leaving a dangerous gap along the middle of the Union fishhook. Anderson's men, Alabamians under Wilcox, Mississippians under Barksdale's supporting elements, and Georgians under Wright moved forward as the sun dipped toward the horizon. Their advance was sudden and violent. Confederate artillery swept the ridge with shells and gray lines surged across the open ground. For a few tense minutes, it appeared the Union center might buckle. Wilcox's brigade punched through an exposed section, capturing several Union cannon. The crest of Cemetery Ridge flickered with musket fire as defenders struggled to hold. But Major General Winfield Scott Hancock, the calm, battle-hardened commander of the Union 2nd Corps, galloped to the threatened point. He rallied retreating regiments and rushed reinforcements into the breach, shouting over the roar of cannon, "Now is the time. Men hold fast for the Republic Union." Batteries unleashed canister at point-blank range, ripping gaps in the Confederate line. After a brutal exchange of volleys and a desperate hand-to-hand struggle around the captured guns, Wilcox and Wright were driven back. The center, though, bloodied held. Ewell strikes the Union right. Meanwhile, on the far northern curve of the fishhook, Lieutenant General Richard Ewell prepared a final gamble of the day. Lee had instructed him to keep pressure on the Union right at Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill, both critical to the Federal position and to the Army's supply line along the Baltimore Pike. As darkness deepened around 7 p.m., Ewell unleashed a thunderous artillery barrage followed by a coordinated infantry assault. 3 brigades stormed up the wooded slopes of Culp's Hill, while 2 more struck Cemetery Hill itself. For the exhausted Union defenders, the attack was sudden and ferocious. The 400 men of Brigadier General George Greene's New York Brigade bore the brunt on Culp's Hill. Earlier that day, Meade had ordered most of the 12th Corps to reinforce the embattled left, leaving Greene's small force to hold the vital heights. Anticipating trouble, Greene had spent the afternoon directing the construction of sturdy breastworks, logs, and stones piled into formidable barricades. As Confederate soldiers scrambled up the steep hillside, they encountered a wall of fire. Greene's men, sheltered behind their hastily built fortifications, fired volley after volley with deadly precision. Despite repeated charges that raged for nearly 3 hours, the Confederates could gain only a small foothold on the lower slopes. The makeshift log and stoneworks, combined with the determination of the New Yorkers, proved impregnable. On neighboring Cemetery Hill, Union defenders also fought tenaciously. Louisiana Tigers and North Carolina regiments surged up the incline, briefly overrunning a Union artillery battery. But counterattacks from the 11th Corps, supported by well-placed canister shot, drove them back in bloody confusion. The summit remained in Federal hands as midnight approached. A field of shadows. When the last gunfire finally sputtered out, an uneasy quiet settled across the battlefield. From the slopes of Culp's Hill to the scarred peach orchard, the ground was littered with the dead and wounded. Lanterns glowed and farmhouses converted into hospitals where surgeons worked through the night by candlelight, their saws rasping and their boots slick with blood. Groans and whispered prayers of the injured carried on the warm night air. Union casualties for the second day's fighting were staggering: over 10,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. Confederate losses approached 7,000. Entire regiments were reduced to fragments. Yet strategically, Meade's army still held the commanding heights and the critical interior lines of the fishhook. Lee's grand plan to turn the Union left and collapse their position had failed. Decisions in the dark. Near midnight, General Meade gathered his corps commanders at the small Leicester farmhouse for a council of war. Candles flickered over weary faces as they debated the next move. Some officers suggested a withdrawal to more secure ground closer to the Union supply line, but most, emboldened by the day's hard-fought success, argued to stay and fight. Meade listened carefully, then concluded, "We shall remain here." His quiet affirmation sealed the decision the Army of the Potomac would hold its ground and await Lee's next blow. Across the way on Seminary Ridge, Lee met with Longstreet and other subordinates. Despite the day's heavy losses and Longstreet's renewed warnings, Lee believed the Union center tested and found momentarily vulnerable during Anderson's evening push was the key. He proposed a massive assault the next day against the midpoint of Cemetery Ridge, preceded by an unprecedented artillery bombardment. Longstreet demurred, predicting catastrophe, but Lee's mind was set. "The enemy is there," he reportedly said. "I am going to strike him." The eve of decision. As the moon climbed above the hills, pickets from both armies exchanged sporadic shots. The cries of the wounded echoed through the humid summer night, mingling with the soft trill of insects. Soldiers on both sides lay exhausted on blood-soaked ground, staring at the stars through drifting smoke. Some shared canteens of water across the lines, others scratched hurried letters home by the light of dying campfires. The Battle of Gettysburg had entered a tense pause. 2 days of brutal combat had failed to break the Union line or force Meade to retreat. Yet Lee remained convinced that one more mighty effort could win the decisive victory the Confederacy so desperately sought. For the men of both armies, July 3rd would bring the greatest trial, yet a storm of fire and steel that would decide not only the battle, but perhaps the fate of the nation. The first pale light of July 3rd, 1863, crept across the Pennsylvania hills, revealing a battlefield shrouded in mist and dread. The second day's slaughter had left both armies battered but unbroken. Union pickets along Culp's Hill shivered in the damp morning air, listening to the distant rumble of wagons and the muffled groans of the wounded. Before the sun burned away the haze, Confederate forces under General Edward Allegheny Johnson struck with sudden ferocity, determined to finish what they had begun the night before. 7 hours of relentless combat. Union engineers and soldiers had worked through the dark hours to reinforce their breastworks, sturdy walls of logs, rails, and stones that snaked through the wooded slopes of Culp's Hill. These fortifications, improvised in haste, would prove their salvation. Johnson's divisions surged upward at dawn, their gray uniforms blending with the morning fog. Rebel yells shattered the quiet as musket fire erupted, echoing through the dense forest. The fighting was brutal and close. Confederate soldiers clambered over rocky ledges, only to be met by sheets of rifle fire from the entrenched Union 12 Corps, which had returned overnight to bolster General George Greene's weary brigade. For 7 unbroken hours, waves of attackers hurled themselves at the earthworks. Trees splintered under relentless musketry. The ground shook with the crash of artillery shells bursting among the branches. Smoke and fog mingled until the woods became a twilight realm of flame and shadow. Again and again, the Confederates tried to outflank the defenders, but each time they were repulsed by withering volleys. Union soldiers firing from cover could reload and shoot with deadly efficiency, while their adversaries struggled up steep slopes slick with dew and blood. It was like shooting game in a thicket, one Northern soldier grimly admitted, though the cost in human life weighed heavily on both sides. By mid-morning, Johnson's men were exhausted and decimated. Their ranks thinned, ammunition low, they finally withdrew, leaving the woods strewn with fallen comrades. Culp's Hill, anchoring the Union right and protecting the vital Baltimore Pike supply line, remained firmly in federal hands. The Union fishhook line was now stronger than ever. Lee reconsiders and doubles down. While the fight raged at Culp's Hill, General Robert E. Lee conferred with his senior officers on Seminary Ridge. The failure to break the Union right forced him to reconsider his strategy. Yet Lee remained convinced that Meade's center along Cemetery Ridge was vulnerable. The previous evening's temporary breach by Anderson's division lingered in his mind as evidence of weakness. Lieutenant General James Longstreet again voiced caution, urging a wide maneuver to threaten Washington or Baltimore and compel Meade to attack on ground of Lee's choosing. But Lee, confident in the courage of his men and unwilling to yield the initiative, decided on a bold stroke, a massive frontal assault aimed at the very heart of the Union line. He ordered a grand artillery bombardment to soften the defenses, followed by an infantry charge across the open fields toward a slight bend in the Union center near a small clump of trees, a place that would soon become known as the Angle. This would be no ordinary attack. Lee assembled nearly 500 soldiers from 3 divisions under Generals George Pickett, J. Johnston Pettigrew, and Isaac Trimble. These men, many veterans of the fiercest battles of the war, would march 3/4 of a mile across open farmland under the concentrated fire of Union artillery and infantry. It was a plan of breathtaking audacity and peril. Union preparations. On Cemetery Ridge, Major General George Meade anticipated that Lee would strike again, but was uncertain where. Reports of the early morning clash at Culpe's Hill convinced him that the enemy might renew efforts on the right. Still, he prudently reinforced the center positioning artillery batteries along the ridge and ensuring reserves were close at hand. General Winfield Scott Hancock's 2nd Corps held the sector targeted for assault, its men seasoned and resolute despite the previous day's trials. The morning passed in uneasy quiet after the guns at Culp's Hill finally fell silent. Soldiers on both sides used the lull to write letters, refill canteens, and tend to the wounded. Chaplains moved among the ranks, offering prayers and comfort. Yet everyone sensed the storm gathering. The humid air seemed to vibrate with expectation, as if the land itself awaited a cataclysm. The stage is set. Shortly after noon, Confederate artillery, more than 150 guns massed along Seminary Ridge, prepared for the greatest bombardment yet seen on the continent. Union gunners along Cemetery Ridge checked their fuses and adjusted their sights. Civilians miles away paused in their chores, unaware that they were about to hear the thunder of a bombardment so immense it would be remembered as the loudest man-made sound in North America to that time. As the men of Pickett, Pettigrew, and Trimble awaited the order to advance, they lay on the warm grass, some joking to mask their nerves, others silently praying. Officers walked the lines, offering brief words of encouragement. Across the open fields, Union soldiers peered through the shimmering summer haze, tightening straps and checking muskets. Many sensed that the next hours would decide not only the battle, but perhaps the fate of the entire war. The morning's brutal struggle for Culp's Hill had ended in Union triumph, but the day's deadliest test still loomed. Soon, the quiet would shatter beneath an artillery storm and a desperate charge that would etch itself into the memory of a nation. As the noon sun burned away the morning haze on July 3rd, a tense hush settled across the ridges around Gettysburg. Both armies sensed that the next clash would decide the battle and perhaps the war itself. While infantrymen waited for the inevitable cannonade, a parallel drama unfolded to the east, where cavalry commanders maneuvered for a decisive strike at the Union rear. Stuart's ambitious plan. Confederate cavalry leader Major General J.E.B. Stuart had arrived late to the campaign after an ill-timed ride around the Union Army left Lee temporarily blind to enemy movements. Eager to redeem his reputation, Stuart sought to play a pivotal role on this climactic day. His assignment circle east of the Union lines and attack their rear in concert with Lee's forthcoming assault on Cemetery Ridge. If successful, Stuart's horsemen could shatter Union supply trains, create chaos behind Meade's front, and trap the Army of the Potomac between infantry and cavalry pincers. At midday, Stuart's columns, roughly 6,000 strong, moved north and west along wooded farm lanes skirting the Union right. Their sabers glinted in the hard light and plumes of dust trailed behind the advancing horses. Stuart hoped to swing wide, then charge into the Federal rear just as Lee's infantry smashed the center. Gregg blocks the path, but the Union cavalry was ready. Brigadier General David McMurtry Gregg, commanding a division of about 5,000 troopers, had anticipated Confederate movement on the right flank. Stationing his men near a crossroads called Rummel's Farm, Gregg created a living shield between Stuart and the vulnerable Union rear. He was soon reinforced by Brigadier General George A. Custer, the flamboyant young Michigan officer whose aggressive tactics had already earned him both admiration and notoriety. Shortly after noon, Stuart's lead elements collided with Gregg's pickets. Carbines cracked and skirmish lines quickly formed amid the split-rail fences and gently rolling fields. The opening exchange was sharp, but controlled until both commanders resolved to force the issue. Thunder of hooves. By early afternoon, the quiet farmland erupted in a full-scale cavalry battle. Stuart massed brigades of seasoned horsemen, Virginians, Carolinians, and Marylanders who advanced behind artillery that fired shells over the heads of their own troopers. Gregg's guns replied the booming duel, sending flocks of birds wheeling against a powder blue sky. Then the bugles sounded for a charge. Custer, shouting his trademark cry, "Come on, you Wolverines," spurred his Michigan regiment straight toward the oncoming gray columns. Hundreds of horses thundered across the field, sabers drawn, the earth trembling beneath their hooves. The two lines crashed together in a deafening clash of steel and flesh. Pistols flared at arm's length, sabers rang as men slashed and parried in a maelstrom of dust and smoke. The fight swirled back and forth across the Rummel Farm meadow. Confederate troopers broke through briefly, only to be hurled back by a countercharge. Gregg's dismounted troopers fired from behind fence rails, while Custer repeatedly hurled his mounted men into the fray, rallying them with fearless bravado. If anyone doubts the courage of cavalry, a Union officer later wrote, "Let him remember this field." After nearly 2 hours of furious combat, Stuart recognized that he could not break Gregg's line. His attempt to reach the Union rear and to perfectly coordinate with Lee's main assault had failed. As the great infantry attack to the west prepared to launch, Stuart's battered cavalry withdrew to regroup, leaving the eastern approaches to the Union army secure. Prelude to the storm. The significance of Gregg and Custer's stand was immense. By blocking Stuart, they denied Lee the simultaneous rear attack he had envisioned to complement the frontal assault soon to come. The Army of the Potomac would face only one hammer blow, not a deadly strike from two directions. As the afternoon wore on, a strange stillness returned to the eastern fields. Smoke drifted lazily above trampled grass where hundreds of horses and men lay dead or wounded. Union troopers tightened girths and cleaned carbines, listening to the distant thunder of artillery massing on Seminary Ridge. They knew the main event was about to unfold. Shortly after 1 p.m., more than 150 Confederate cannon opened the most massive bombardment of the war, shaking the ground from one end of the battlefield to the other. Union guns replied in kind, and for nearly 2 hours, the two sides traded a rolling storm of iron and fire. Windows rattled miles away. Townsfolk 50 miles distant reported the sound like distant thunder. Amid this deafening barrage, the men of Pickett, Pettigrew, and Trimble waited in the tree line for the order that would send them across nearly a mile of open ground toward the Union center. On Cemetery Ridge Union, soldiers crouched behind stone walls and shallow trenches, watching the enemy's artillery flashes through the smoke. Major General Winfield Scott Hancock strode calmly along the line, encouraging his men. "Hold this ground," he told them, "and the day is ours." The cavalry clash on the eastern flank had ended in a hard-won Union success, but the battle's decisive moment was now at hand. The thunder of the great cannonade signaled that Lee's boldest gamble, the grand infantry assault that history would remember as Pickett's charge, was about to begin. The ground shook as if the earth itself rebelled. Shortly after 1 p.m. on July 3, 1863, more than 150 Confederate cannon roared in unison from Seminary Ridge, unleashing the largest artillery bombardment of the war. The thunder rolled across the Pennsylvania hills, rattling windows miles away and sending birds wheeling in startled flocks. Inside Gettysburg, civilians huddled in cellars as walls trembled and plaster rained from ceilings. For nearly 2 hours, the barrage continued, a relentless storm meant to pulverize the Union center on Cemetery Ridge and clear a path for a final decisive assault. Union gunners answered, with measured volleys, conserving ammunition and waiting for the right moment to strike back. Smoke thickened until the midday sun dimmed to a copper haze. Soldiers on both sides stuffed cotton or paper in their ears against the deafening concussions. The very air seemed full of flame, one Federal artilleryman recalled. Then, as Confederate ammunition dwindled and the cannonade tapered off, the next phase began. Out of the woods along Seminary Ridge emerged long, glinting lines of infantry, 3 divisions totaling roughly 12,500 men under Generals George Pickett, J. Johnston Pettigrew, and Isaac Trimble. Their gray and butternut ranks stretched nearly a mile, flags snapping in the hot breeze. Drums beat a steady cadence as they stepped off across the open farmland toward the Union center. From Cemetery Ridge Union, soldiers watched in grim silence. Some marveled at the precision of the advancing lines. Like a grand review, one veteran said before officers barked orders to ready their muskets. Artillery crews swabbed barrels and checked fuses. Major General Winfield Scott Hancock, calm and commanding, despite an earlier wound, rode the line, urging his men to hold. The Confederate advance began at a deliberate pace. The distance to the Union position was nearly 3/4 of a mile, with no cover but a few rail fences. After a few hundred yards, Federal artillery opened fire. Solid shot tore great holes in the gray formations. Men fell in rows, but the lines closed and pressed forward. Canister and shell followed shrieking through the smoke. Still, the Confederates came, their flags bobbing through the haze, their famous rebel yell rising as they neared rifle range. At about 300 yards, Union infantry unleashed a crashing volley. Musket fire rippled down the ridge, mowing swaths through the attackers. Yet Pickett's men quickened their pace, stepping over fallen comrades, determined to reach the stone wall that marked the Federal line. Brigades angled toward a slight bend in the ridge near a small clump of trees, a spot that would be remembered as the high watermark of the Confederacy. Despite devastating losses, a portion of the assault force under Brigadier General Lewis Armistead broke through. Armistead himself leapt the stone wall, waving his hat atop his sword to urge his men on. For a brief, breathless moment, Confederate troops seized 2 Union guns and forced a gap in the line. But Hancock had anticipated this crisis. Reserves surged forward. Union artillery pivoted to pour canister into the breach at point-blank range. Musket fire from all sides converged in a deadly crossfire. The Confederate momentum faltered. Ammunition ran low. Surrounded and outnumbered, the attackers fought desperately with bayonets and clubbed muskets. Armistead fell mortally wounded near the captured guns. One by one, the gray-clad regiments broke and began the long, harrowing retreat across the same deadly ground they had crossed minutes earlier. Of the 12,500 who had stepped off so bravely, barely half returned to Seminary Ridge. Union soldiers watched the shattered columns fall back, many too stunned to cheer. The grassy slope before them was carpeted with fallen men, Confederate and Union alike, testament to the charge's terrible cost. Smoke drifted low over the field, mingling with the cries of the wounded and the acrid smell of powder. For the Confederacy, Pickett's charge marked the high watermark, the closest the Southern cause would come to decisive victory on Northern soil. General Robert E. Lee rode among the survivors, acknowledging responsibility. "It is all my fault," he reportedly told those who wept over their losses. He ordered the army to prepare for a Union counterattack that never came. Meade's forces, themselves bloodied and exhausted, chose to hold their strong positions. As dusk fell on July 3rd, an eerie quiet settled over Gettysburg. The great gamble had failed. Lee's proud army of Northern Virginia, once unstoppable, now faced retreat. The fields before Cemetery Ridge were strewn with more than 6,000 Confederate casualties. Union losses, though heavy, were far fewer. The tide of the war had turned, and the Confederacy would never again threaten the North with such force. The men of both armies knew they had witnessed a pivotal moment. Veterans who survived spoke of the strange beauty of the field at sunset, the fading light over shattered fences, the soft rustle of a summer breeze across blood-soaked grass, the silence broken only by the low moans of the dying. Gettysburg had become a crucible where courage and sacrifice were tested to their limits, and where the fate of a divided nation began to tilt irrevocably toward Union. Dawn of July 4th, 1863, rose heavy with mist and silence. After 3 days of unrelenting battle, the hills and fields around Gettysburg lay scarred and eerily still. The thunder of cannon had ceased, replaced by the low murmur of stretcher-bearers and the moans of thousands of wounded men scattered across the countryside. The Union Army remained in firm possession of Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, and the rocky bastion of Little Round Top. Across the valley, Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, once so confident, now faced the bitter reality of defeat. Lee's painful withdrawal. Lee convened his generals before dawn. His plan for a renewed assault dissolved in the face of staggering casualties and exhausted troops. Ammunition wagons were low and morale sagged under the weight of the failed charge. Accepting responsibility, Lee resolved to withdraw south toward the Potomac. He began organizing a massive wagon train carrying thousands of wounded soldiers, a grim caravan more than 16 miles long. Rain began to fall as Confederate columns quietly pulled back through the narrow mountain passes, cavalry screening their retreat. Union forces under General George Meade shadowed them, cautiously probing but not committing to a full-scale pursuit. Meade, newly in command and mindful of his own army's heavy losses, refused to risk a reckless counterattack. Critics in Washington would later question his restraint, but his army had suffered over 23,000 casualties and needed rest as desperately as Lee's. A field of horror. For those left behind, the aftermath was almost beyond comprehension. Nearly 51,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing, making Gettysburg the bloodiest battle of the Civil War. Horses by the thousands lay where they fell, their bodies bloating in the summer heat. The stench of death hung over the fields. Local civilians whose farms and homes had become unwilling fortresses faced the grim task of burying the dead and tending the wounded. Church pews became hospital beds. Living rooms became operating theaters. Surgeons worked tirelessly in makeshift hospitals. Amputated limbs piled high outside farmhouses. The Lutheran seminary, the courthouse, and countless barns overflowed with the injured. Women of Gettysburg, Mary Wade, Elizabeth Thorne, and many others moved among the wounded with water and bread, offering what comfort they could. Their quiet heroism saved lives, even as disease and infection claimed more each day. The broader turning point. While Lee's battered army retreated across the Potomac, another Union triumph unfolded far to the west. On that same July 4th, General Ulysses S. Grant accepted the surrender of Vicksburg, giving the Union full control of the Mississippi River and effectively splitting the Confederacy in two. Together, the twin victories of Gettysburg and Vicksburg marked a decisive turning point in the war. The Confederate dream of invading the North and of European recognition faded into impossibility. Gettysburg also reshaped the psychological landscape. For the first time, Lee's aura of invincibility was broken. The Confederate Army would fight on for nearly 2 more years, but never again would it launch a major offensive into Union territory with such promise of success. Northern morale, shaken by earlier defeats, surged with renewed hope. A nation remembers. In November 1863, President Abraham Lincoln journeyed to this hallowed ground to dedicate the Soldiers' National Cemetery. Standing on the very field where so many had fallen, he delivered the Gettysburg Address, just 272 words yet immortal. Lincoln spoke of a new birth of freedom, affirming that the dead had not perished in vain, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. His simple, solemn words transformed the battlefield into a symbol of national purpose. One curious relic of the fight drew visitors for decades. Major General Daniel Sickles' right leg amputated after a cannonball shattered it on July 2nd. Preserved in the Army Medical Museum in Washington, D.C., the leg became an emblem of the war's grim realities and of a general whose controversial decision to advance his corps helped shape the battle's course. Legacy of sacrifice. Today, the rolling hills and ridges of Gettysburg stand quiet, marked by monuments and silent cannons. But the echoes of those 3 desperate days in July remain. The peach orchard's gnarled trees, the boulders of Devil's Den, the windswept crest of Little Round Top, all bear witness to the courage and suffering of tens of thousands who fought there. Gettysburg was more than a Union victory. It was a crucible that tested the nation's ideals. The men who stood in those lines, farmers and clerks, immigrants and freedmen, fought not only for territory, but for the enduring proposition that a nation conceived in liberty could survive its own division. Their sacrifice ensured that the United States would remain one country, its destiny still unfolding.